that was located in the garage. The defense would like this court to believe the bloodstaining in the garage can't be related back to the bloodstaining in the alcove. And they would have you believe the bloodstaining in the garage could have resulted from Michele cutting her hand on the ice 6 months earlier, before September 11th. Against the back wall? There's no evidence of any bloodletting event by Michele that would account for the bloodstaining in the alcove and on the rug. But we know this much. The rug in the alcove gets washed every several weeks by Barb Thayer. So whatever bloodstaining event occurred recently, and there's no reason to believe anyone would leave spattered blood on the door and on the molding for any length of time if they knew that it was there. The bloodstain on Area 5 was readily apparent, and the bloodstain on the door, although small, would likely be noticed over time. And I'd submit clearly the bloodstaining in the alcove was recently deposited. So I'd like to talk about the bloodstaining in the garage to ascertain whether there are characteristics that would suggest that the blood was deposited more recently than 6 months before, and therefore connected to the blood in the alcove and the blood on the rug. Now, when looking at the garage floor, the first thing that you notice when you look at these photographs of the garage floor is an area that appears cleaner than the other areas. And what did Investigator Anderson do? He got out his lights and looked in the cracks and the crevices, because that's what you do when you suspect there had been some cleanup activity or an area of the garage floor appeared cleaner than other areas. And lo and behold, what does he find? Blood in the cracks, in the crevices, in the depressions. Now, looking at people's photograph 108, it appears the clean area is centered around E and H. That would be in this area. 109 shows an overhead view. Cleaner, not cleaner. And if you look closely at the area between E and H, what do we see? An area that looks more clean. People's 90, 91. And 92. So blood deep in the cracks along the edges where the paint is chipped up. And on 92, it shows clearly how the blood is under the edge. That's more raised up. And no blood on any of the painted surfaces. '93 and 94 show different chips. And you can see blood in the cracks. And how clean the paint is. Now, before moving on to another section of the floor, I'd like to address another one thing. Pat Laternis said this was consistent with being deposited with a blood-soaked object, wiping through that area and depositing that blood up under the edge of the paint. What does Mr. Labor say? Well, first he tries to suggest he did some kind of experiment relating to the blood stain in the edges of the paint chips. So what does he do? He spreads blood out on an unpainted, pitted concrete floor. No paint, no paint edges. And then cleans it up off the concrete, which is not even remotely related to what was present in the Harris garage. But then he proffered a demonstration of some chipped paint on a concrete wall, and he took minuscule amounts of blood and pushed them around on a dry rag on a vertical surface, and was purportedly unable to recreate that situation. But this court will recall that he was asked on cross, "You didn't try cleaning up blood on a painted floor where the paint was flaking up." And he acknowledged he didn't. He didn't even attempt it. Doesn't that seem almost incredible that an expert who listened to the testimony of the people's expert didn't attempt to recreate the conditions in the Harris household? I submit there are 50,000 reasons why he didn't do that. And I submit that that's what he meant in that email about neutralizing the evidence. You don't need a master's degree in fluid dynamics to know when you try to clean up a floor when the paint is chipping up, you get blood under the edges of the paint. And that's what we see in the Harris house on the garage floor. So now let's go to Area D. People's photograph 77 shows a section in Area D where there is paint chipped up from the floor. The paint also appears to have some scratching in it. A closer view, People 78, shows blood along the edges of the chipped paint. And blood in low-lying areas of the chip. And blood in the scratches and gouges of the paint. Blood in a small nick in the paint. And what you don't see in that photograph is blood on the painted surface of the floor. People 79, another area of chipped paint. You can see blood in the chips. The edges of the paint chips. People's 80, a closer view. We see the same pattern where the blood has been pushed up underneath along the edges where the paint is raised up. And there is no blood to be found on the painted surface. The painted surface is all clean. People 76 is a photo of a transfer or contact stain in Area D that appears to be altered. And you can see the striations running perpendicular to the stain. That appears to be as if something had went across it. So now looking at H, we start to see a transition zone between the grimy area and the cleaner or not grimy area. And what you see in H, on People's 88, are two stains that have been obviously altered. Now moving on to Area J, that's the area adjacent to H. And it's significantly grimier, significantly dirtier than D, E, F, and H. And to really understand and appreciate what went on in the Harris's garage, you really have to understand the characteristics of the staining in Area J. So let's look at Peoples 100. And in Peoples 100, you see hundreds of stains. In varying states of dilution. Both experts agreed the blood was diluted prior to deposit. And both experts acknowledged that diluted blood can be projected into areas adjacent to where a cleanup event had occurred. And I submit that's exactly what occurred here. Going back to Peoples 109. And what do we see? A cleaner area. A grimier area. In a transition zone between the cleaner area and the grimier area. Almost in an arc. And as you look closely at Area J, and if we look at Peoples 102, you can see spatter stains in various states of dilution. What you don't see is in the chipped areas, any blood up underneath the edges of the chipped. And you see what you almost never saw in the clean area, blood on the painted surface of the floor. This is in the grimier area. And there are several stains that appear in the cement, but no blood along the edge of the paint. Because all of these stains are the result of being cast off or projected off into this grimier area, which was never touched with a mop or a rag or a cloth. And so what you see are pristine, unaltered spatter stains projected into that area from the clean area. There's no blood in the edges of the paint because it never would have been put under the edges through the action of any cleaning. This is the dirty area. Peoples 99 and 101 show some of the hundreds of stains in the varying states of dilution in Area J. And now, looking at Peoples 98. 98 is significant because it shows when a blood spatter stain lands on and covers a scratch in the paint. And when the stain was deposited, the blood accumulated in the depression of the scratch. Now, what would happen if you were to clean that stain? You would remove the stain from the painted surface, but the blood would remain in the scratch. And that is exactly what you see in Area D, and the area between E and H, in the clean area. Now looking at Peoples 66, you have this cleaner area. Where you see the blood in the cracks and the crevices and along the edges, but not on the painted surface of the floor. You have Area J that shows diluted stains and has all the earmarks that they were projected from that area that was clean. And yet, with all those hundreds of stains in Area J, there are no stains in the cracks and the crevices. you have obvious wiping marks in the transition zone between areas H and J. I submit that the evidence that a cleanup event occurred in the garage is overwhelming. And in light of that, when you go back and reconsider what was observed in the alcove, it is also obvious that several of the stains were also subjected to a cleanup. The stain at area 1 had been altered. And the stains at areas 4 and 5 were wiped through. And stain 6 was altered on the left side of the stain. And overlaying all of this are the results of the DNA testing of these areas. Areas 3, 4, and 6 all came back with full DNA profiles matching Michele. The transfer stain on the carpet, B31C, came back with a full profile matching Michele. And 4 additional stains on the carpet, B31E, F, G, and H, came back with full profiles matching Michele. Areas 2 and 5 came back with partial profiles that were consistent with Michele, and she couldn't be excluded. Michele Harris was attacked by her husband when she walked through that door. Her blood was spattered in that alcove. And then she was moved to the garage. And in the garage, she bled on the floor. Where she was ultimately killed in that very spot. She bled on the floor of the garage, and the defendant cleaned up that blood. But as is usually the case, his efforts were incomplete. Now, areas A, D, the area between E and H, and J in the garage all came back with a full profile that matched Michele. And C was a full profile that was consistent with Michele, and she could not be excluded. These were not some unrelated events separated in time. In fact, there may not be a scientific test that tells us exactly, precisely, because it's the limitations of science, when these things were deposited, when these blood stains were deposited, but we can date the deposit. The rug was washed every several weeks. The clean area on the garage floor was still clean. The dirty area was still dirty. Clean areas don't get clean by having people walk on them. In the dirty area of the garage floor, in area J, the stains are all intact. They are pristine. They haven't been altered. They're on top of the grime. That tells us that this was all from a recent event. We can also date the cleanup. Because for blood to get into the gouges and the depressions and the cracks and the crevices, it had to be liquid. And the person doing the cleaning would have had to have been there when blood was liquid. This is one scene, one event, tied together by Michele's DNA and the defendant's desire to make his intimate adversary disappear. Michele Harris was murdered in that spot late in the evening on the 11th by that man sitting right there. We obviously never found Michele or the murder weapon or the papers that were on the island. We never found Michele's purse. We never found any bloody clothing from the defendant. But I would submit to this court that someone planning this would put all the evidence into the same place, and that the defendant had ample time and the benefit of darkness to dispose of that evidence. He had 9 months to plan out what he would do with her body, what he would do with the evidence. And that's what he did with it. Where did he hide her body? I don't know. It's in that place that he was confident would make her disappear. And all the searching, and all the ponds, and all the fields, and all the woods, and all the old wells is not going to bring Michele's body home to her family and her children. He picked a good place in all those barren acres and acres and acres surrounding the Harris homestead. So what actually happened? When September 11th, 2001 rolled around, the defendant believed Michele was rejecting his last offer in the divorce, which he knew was going to expose him to having to pay her a much greater figure than the $700,000 he had offered in the August 1st letter. So on the night of September 11th, 2001, when most people were concerned about what had just happened earlier in the day, the defendant, concerned only with himself, how this would benefit him, put in his motion, his plan to make Michele disappear. And I would argue that he believed the ensuing confusion of 9/11 would somehow give him cover, as well as Michele's planned visit to New York, of course not scheduled until later in the week. And on that night, got done with work and went not to drink or go out to a bar, but to her boyfriend Brian Early's apartment, like almost every other American that day, to talk to someone close about what had happened to our collective consciousness that day. She left there about 11 o'clock. She made it home. She parked in the garage. She went into the house and got the door closed. And at some point, she was struck by Mr. Harris, and she bled. And she was struck again, and this now spattered her blood. Spattered in the corner of the kitchen alcove, spattered on the door leading to the garage, spattered on the molding just above the floor, spattered on the rug. And at some point, a 7/8 by 7/8 inch object covered in her blood came into contact with that carpet that was right there. Something got onto things on the counter because the school folders and barbed calendars she used to mark her hours that were there from the night before disappeared and were never found. The defendant had been an athlete. Michele didn't weigh much. And it would have been nothing for him to open the door and carry her out to the garage just a few feet away. That would explain why there's no blood trail between the two, the kitchen alcove and the garage floor. And there, on her own garage floor, with her 4 young children sleeping upstairs with their sound machines on, Michele Taylor Harris bled some more, took her last breath, and died. The defendant had garbage bags on the shelving in the garage to put everything in. And then he took her body to a place in that rural countryside that he had previously found and knew would make her disappear, fulfilling his promise to do just that. And at some point, he cleaned up the blood. I submit this whole murder and disposing of Michele and cleaning up would have taken not much more than just a couple hours. And then the final act of removing the evidence was moving the van, the extension of Michele, back down to the end of the driveway. He walked back up the driveway and waited for 7 o'clock to roll around in the morning so he could call Barb there and have her find the van at the end of the driveway. Your Honor, the evidence in this case logically leads to only one conclusion, and one conclusion only. There's no mystery about what happened to Michele. It was the defendant, Calvin Harris, who murdered his wife so that he could keep what he considered his. The defendant got the life he wanted, Michele, out of the picture. She thought she was going to get the kids. There's only one person in this case who had any motive to kill Michele Harris. Only one person who stood to benefit from her death, and that's the defendant. There's only one person who she identified as a threat to her by fleeing from her home and taking the guns out of the home, and that's the defendant. There's only one person who threatened to kill her if she didn't stop the divorce, and that's the defendant. There's only one person who said he would make her disappear, and that's the defendant. There's only one person who would have known specific things that no one but Michele's killer would have known, and that's the defendant. There's only one person who said and did things in the days and weeks following Michele's disappearance that were consistent with being guilty of her murder and inconsistent with his innocence, and that's the defendant. The person responsible for Michele Taylor Harris's death is a person you would expect. Michele died in an act of domestic violence at the hands of her familiar adversary. Michele died at the hands of her husband, the defendant, Calvin Harris.